If you stare for long enough into the abyss stares back at you. This is a quote from Friedrich Nietzsche, the German philosopher. And it's probably one of his most famous quotes, and it's been interpreted in many ways and contextualized in many ways. The way that I've always thought about it relates to something that I think is one of the most remarkable yet, in the context I'm going to talk about it in today, potentially dangerous traits of humans, which is that we are capable of becoming accustomed and getting used to almost anything in the right set of circumstances. When I say the right set of circumstances, I don't necessarily mean that. In fact, I rarely mean that in a positive way. Now, it's important to distinguish here that what I'm about to talk about, the main theme of this video, is situations where we have some agency or choice over the situation that we're in. And almost the duty of care that we owe ourselves because, well, firstly, because we should care about ourselves, and secondly, because self-destruction is often a form of destruction in the sense it can spread a lot and usually it affects other people beyond ourselves. So a duty of care to ourselves is also a duty of care to others. But just going back to the original caveat I was talking about, it's important to distinguish between situations where we have a choice, we have some agency over whether we allow ourselves to get used to them, and situations where we don't. Just to give you an example of probably the greatest book I've ever read, and I really recommend that anyone reads it, is Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, which is a memoir of... So Viktor Frankl was a psychotherapist in, I believe, Germany prior to the Nazis getting into power. He was also Jewish, and so ended up in Auschwitz, and basically had his PhD and all of his life's work torn up in front of his eyes while he was going into Auschwitz, and managed to use that time, managed to survive, of course, and write this book that I'm talking about, but reflected on his time in there. And it's quite amazing, really, to think that someone could actually be in that situation and kind of have the mental wherewithal to observe these patterns of human behavior, and then, remember it all and actually then recount it in a book. Like, just to actually survive that is remarkable, let alone to manage to write one of the greatest books of all time. But he observes in that people, including himself, were able to adjust and become accustomed to a situation that, of course, they had not chosen to be in and could not escape. And so one of the most, I forget exactly the wording, but one of the most famous quotes of that book is that when, it's something to the effect of, when external circumstances are outside our control, we're challenged to basically control the space between, control what is controllable. It's almost a version of the Serenity Prayer, accept the things that you can't change the things you can, have the wisdom to know the difference. What I want to talk about today, it's quite a tangent, but what I want to talk about today is where we do actually have the choice, where we can end up becoming accustomed to darkness. And I want to give a specific example of this from my own personal life and, my previous professional life in criminal justice. So I used to work in, I'm not going to name the London prison, but a particular London prison in north of London. This is I worked in quite a few prisons, and some of the kind of newer build prisons. So, for example, another prison I worked in southeast London. It's kind of how you imagine a prison to look. It's like when you've probably seen films, like a lot of people imagine a prison to look like an American-style prison, and it to be quite modern. And to, when I walked around this particular prison in southeast London, it looked like how I imagined a prison to look like. This, but that wasn't where I ended up. That was where I was supposed to start working. Where I ended up working for about a year and a half was one of the old Victorian prisons in North London. If it wouldn't take that much research to figure out where I'm talking about, just don't want to name any particular names. This is the I can't even describe it to you. When I say Victorian prisons, that means that it was built in the Victorian era. But honestly, walking into this place, it's like you've walked back in time. It's like the closest thing I've come across in my life to an actual time machine. I remember literally walking in and just thinking, what the fuck? Like, what the hell have I signed up for? What is this place? But again, this is the first. This is not where I'm going with the story so much, but this is the first thing that very quickly became normalized. So the first time I've gone into this place, I've thought, what the hell have I signed up for? Do I really want to do this? This is where I'm going to be every day. You know, I'm someone who really believes in, if you can be in the environment you work in, the environment you spend a lot of your time in, is extremely important in terms of the energy that you're around. And obviously, if you decide to work in prisons, then you know that it's not going to be the best energy, but there's levels to it. And this particular prison, just the conditions of it are shockingly bad. And you know, whatever your views on criminal justice are, whatever you think, you know, maybe perhaps, you know, personally, I don't believe. I strongly believe that prison, the deprivation of liberty, is meant to be the punishment. You're not supposed to go to prison for more punishment. That is the punishment, if that makes sense. Even if you're of the belief that actually prison should be more punitive, which honestly, most people who've actually been inside a prison don't tend to think like that. It tends to be people who are just, not edgy. I don't mean this in a derogatory way, but I would say, a more 90% of people that have worked in a prison realise that just being in the places right now in the UK the way they are, even the better ones, is definitely enough of a punishment. But even if you were of the view that, even if you had a more punitive perspective, honestly, the conditions of this particular prison would still, I believe, shock pretty much anyone. So the office that I'm working in at this point is a converted cell on one of the wings. It's in what's known as a sterile area, which is like between two parts of a particular wing. So it's like you're not actually, the converted cell is not next door to other cells where, you know, like a prisoner could just wander in. There's gates, but basically other than those gates, you're just on the wing. And yeah, like you've got this tiny window. You've basically got the same space to work out of that a prisoner has, that they're basically residing in. So this is the atmosphere, and the atmosphere is awful, but, you know, the work was what I wanted to do at the time, and it was interesting work, and it was, I believed, important work. Ultimately, I came to believe that actually the system is so deeply flawed that you could do pieces of good work, but ultimately they wouldn't really go anywhere. But the actual specific job that I was doing was, my title was family engagement worker, and what I was basically doing was most of the issues I was dealing with were, for example, where someone wants contact with one of their children. So you've got, say, a man who's perhaps their partner is on the outside, and they've in most cases the people who are applying for appointments with me, who I'd then go and see and potentially work with and try to help sort these issues out. And the point of sorting the issues out was that at the time the project was the particular project that I was contracted by was trying to establish different areas. So family was one. There were 7 pathways. So drugs and alcohol was another one. Housing was another one. Basically areas where if you could sort out those areas for that person on the outside, you'd set them up with the best chance to be rehabilitated. Essentially going back to a point that I think I've made before, and a point that I've sort of carried forward into the work I'm doing here at Ascendance, that there's no choices without chances, and you're trying to give people at least the chance to change, all the while knowing that it's ultimately still a choice. But anyway, I kind of digress. That was, in most cases, the people that are applying for appointments, and then I'm seeing and potentially arranging, for example, family mediation for. I later qualified as a mediator and did some of that work. Otherwise, it would be just setting those things up, speaking to potentially solicitors, speaking to social workers. It was I won't go into the specifics of the job too much, but generally speaking, the people I was working with were not, their offences did not relate to anything to do with children, anything to do with even domestic violence. It was generally a case that perhaps someone's partner has, started seeing someone else on the outside. That is often a scenario, if someone is doing quite a few years, in a sense, objectively speaking, it's understandable that their partner may not stay loyal to them and may not move on. But in many cases then, if there's a child involved and then suddenly that man is not able to see their child, then it's not really a fair scenario, particularly if, for example, the offence has got nothing to do with anything family related. Now, just to kind of expand on another thing to do with the prison, in terms of, so like I said, this particular wing that I'm working on here is not, it's like a normal wing. You might have heard the term nonce before for a sex offender, in particular, like a child sex offender. Now, nonce is an acronym for not on normal correctional exercise, which basically means you can't normally put those people on the normal wing. So, for example, like the wing I'm working on at this time, because the other prisoners would probably kill them, almost definitely, if they found out what the offence was. And there was, I'm not going to refer to this the name of the actual wing, so I'll call it the nonce wing. But yeah, the vulnerable prisoner wing actually is the technical term. Sometimes you'll get someone like, for example, if there's like a football player or a celebrity who's in prison, they might get put on the nonce wing. Or if there's an officer who, like a former officer or a police officer, or someone who basically might get killed by the other prisoners or is likely to get attacked by the other prisoners, they'll generally go onto the VP wing, the vulnerable prisoner wing, or the nonce wing, whatever we want to call it. However, that is actually a decision often that the offender has a say in. So generally speaking, it's advisable that if that is the sort of type of crime you've been convicted of, that you would go onto that wing. However, sometimes there are exceptions, and I would say that usually the exceptions are where you have someone who, for example, has narcissistic personality disorder and is a nonce, or someone who is a psychopath and is also a nonce. Then they may have the arrogance to actually think that they will, and sometimes, as pertains to this story, the arrogance is actually backed up by the genuine ability to manipulate and deceive the people around them to not believe that they're a nonce. So the character in the story, who obviously I'm not going to name, is someone who has committed one of the most horrific child-related sex offences that I have ever seen the case files for. I was actually reminded to make this, I was reminded of this story because at the time of recording, Ian Watkins, the former Lost Prophets singer, was just murdered quite recently in HMP Wakefield, which is a nonce jail, is specifically nonces. That was another one of the most horrific case files that I've ever read. But this, if you think of that case, this was on a similar sort of level. So, that information about that particular case is, readily available online. So that's the sort of level that we're talking. And this person's chosen to be on the normal wing, but they're extremely, prisoners in general, because they've got a lot of time, potentially, obviously you're going to have a higher level of psychopaths in prison than you're going to have in a normal, the normal population. Now, if you've got a psychopath who's particularly manipulative and then you give them all the time in the world in a prison to basically have not a lot else to do except cook up sort of manipulative plans and always try and play people like a game of chess, which is, if you know anything about psychopathy, kind of what psychopaths will tend to do. It's a formula where it will bring out the worst even in a psychopath, and where we're talking about a psychopath who's also a nonce, it doesn't really get much worse than that. Now, where I'm going with this story is this particular character decides to try to manipulate me. So, as the family worker, obviously that guy is not eligible to see his child. And if I was to go into the specifics of the situation, which honestly would probably traumatize anyone listening to this, because it's genuinely quite traumatic. There's particular reasons why there's absolutely no way, like I don't think I even need to sort of state that, given the fact that he's a nonce. But it's like, even the circumstances are specifically just that there's no chance, and obviously just almost to try and mess with my mind specifically, to probably then see what I would do next. And like, I wouldn't even, I would, I was about 23 at the time, so I think I actually knew enough to know that I didn't even know what the game that he was trying to play exactly was. But by this point, I'm reading these kind of case files, I'm dealing with all this kind of, I'm in this incredibly dark environment, and this whole thing was going on for quite a long time with this particular, I'd actually said on various occasions, like, that, stop putting these applications in, but each time the applications would say something slightly different. And obviously I'm dealing with, people who've committed extremely violent crimes on a daily basis. And so you're constantly hearing this stuff. It just becomes normal. And this would kind of be highlighted to me, not the exact story with this guy, but this kind of lack of normality to everyday people, but normality in the prison system. That when I was, a lot of people who work in prisons, a lot of prison officers, a lot of even civilian staff, they tend to hang out with other people who work in criminal justice, and what they talk about all the time is criminal justice. And I had friends in the criminal justice system, and what would always be, a lot of alcohol would always be drunk, and what would always be talked about was the work, and is what people's way of dealing with the kind of level of stress of the work, basically offloading. But then, I was 23 at the time, so I had a pretty active social life, whatever, and I would go to a normal party of, like, an old friend at the weekend, for example, and I would, they would all be working in marketing or sales or finance or whatever, and they'd just be talking about random work anecdotes, and then I'd be talking about violent offenders, murderers, nonsense or whatever, and the reactions I would get from people would be interested in the stuff, but just be like, what the fuck, Jay? Like, and it would highlight to me then, like, well, I don't know if it did highlight to me, actually. I would kind of think, well, why are you so surprised? Like, this is the world we're in, which unfortunately it is, but most people are not exposed to that side of the world most of the time. But I was exposed to it every single day, as was, and still is, anyone working in that system. Now, I got to the point where I actually was genuinely considering, for about a week. Prisoners are very, they've got a lot of time to observe things, pick up on things, and there was particular violent offenders on that wing who I knew, if I was to just leave a piece of paper lying around and, to basically give anyone a chance to glimpse at something, which they would definitely try to glimpse at, try and find, you really couldn't obviously share information about different prisoners to other prisoners. And I just thought, this guy's trying to mess with my mind, this nonce is on the normal wing. But if I was to just leave this piece of paper here, then this person might then kill this guy and remove, and trust me, this would not be a tragedy. Like, I know that sounds quite harrowing just hear this, but yeah, if you knew the crimes, then you would, no one rational or sane would mourn this particular guy. But that doesn't mean that, obviously, and I'm kind of stating the obvious here, that would not make it right for me as a 23-year-old civilian member of staff to be playing God and enacting the death penalty on someone. And furthermore, then, the person who, just like the people who just killed Ian Watkins, they're likely to get a life sentence put on top of the sentences they were serving. So, you go on a video about the death of Ian Watkins, and you got a whole bunch of people saying, yeah, this is fantastic, these guys should be released early or whatever. And honestly, I kind of agree, but they won't be. They'll be given a life sentence on top of that. for murder, because that's what they've done. And the thing is, with the way the law is and the way the criminal justice system is, just because you emotionally feel something, it doesn't mean the law can actually reflect that. In fact, there's a famous legal maxim: law is reason free from passion. So that is the right thing, just like it would be completely the wrong thing to get a nonce killed by another prisoner and to almost be, you know, I don't think I need to explain why that's wrong. But the point I'm circling back to is that had become normalised for me to the point where that was something I was genuinely considering. And I remember speaking to my dad about it at the time and saying, oh yeah, I'm thinking about doing this because of this and this. And he just looked at me and said, Jay, if you're seriously thinking about that, you need to consider changing careers. And at that moment it was like, what was probably, yeah, well, what is very obvious in hindsight, what is obvious to anyone listening to this, and what would be obvious to anyone objectively looking at that situation, only hit me at that moment because I'd allowed the abyss to stare back at me that I was staring into, to the point where I was almost ready to become a monster. And in a sense, that is a monstrous thing to do, to be playing God like that. Now, of course, the difference is that I didn't do that, and, you know, I came to my senses, and probably, I like to think, would have done even without the intervention of that particular conversation. In fact, this is the importance of talking to people, and, you know, people who aren't necessarily in the same situation, and sharing things. And, you know, really, I think that anyone in that job, just like anyone who's a therapist, is legally obliged to be in clinical supervision. I think anyone working in this kind of line of work should be in some form of clinical supervision regularly. We did have clinical supervision actually with Petra, who's still a very good friend of mine. But it was like once every 3 months, and then they discontinued that. So that was, yeah, that was not really adequate. But anyway, I'm going to leave it there. This is a lot longer than I planned this video to be. But the point, really, I just wanted to share this story to illustrate the point that we have a duty of care not to let ourselves become engulfed by any kind of abyss. So perhaps you don't work in the justice industry and this exact story is not relatable, but perhaps you're in an environment where you think you're being kind of a martyr, you think you're doing the right thing by being around darkness all the time. But understand that if you're around darkness all the time, that darkness will start to affect you, and you may become the very darkness that you went into that situation, or darkness, or just mental illness, stress. That will, no matter how strong you think you are, you know, I really thought that I was incredibly mentally strong and resilient, which, you know, in some ways I may have been, but no matter how mentally resilient you believe you are, it will affect you. And yeah, we owe a duty of care to ourselves, and by proxy to others, to not become the monsters that, I guess, lie in that abyss. And I'll leave it there.